A 1999 Harley-Davidson Sportster 1200 Custom. That's what we'll be working on in this video. Any of these 90s Sportsters are really quite affordable. You can find them under $3,000 fairly easily. Even low mileage ones are quite cheap these days. The problem is that the colors really are outdated. The whole style of them is kind of outdated. So we're cleaning this one up a little bit. We're going to go to kind of a raw metal look with it. We're going to switch the fuel tank to something that's a little skinnier, give it more of a chopper feel, I guess. The first thing we're doing though is just taking the fender off here. This was actually harder to do than we expected. There was some work done on the turn signals in the past, and instead of routing everything through a connector, they had spliced it directly into the harness. So we had to cut everything off to get that fender off. Then removing these chrome pieces that the turn signals were mounted to, that was a little more difficult than we expected. It was mounted behind the shock, so that had to be removed to get those off, but we eventually got it done. There are a couple things to be aware of on these 90s Sportsters. They leak oil from the head gasket pretty commonly. They used a cheap paper gasket in the 90s for the head gasket. They ended up making a better quality one in the 2000s, and there's a lot of aftermarket gaskets available to replace them on these 90s ones and use the same style that they ended up developing in the 2000s. But if it hasn't been replaced in the past, that's something you'll have to anticipate doing. Another thing we noticed is they do vibrate more than the 2000s era Sportsters. That's really all we've had in the past. But they did not rubber mount these engines, so it wasn't isolated from the frame. So it is a lot shakier than you would see on like a post 2006 Sportster. But it's really not too bad. Now we're moving on to taking the front wheel off. The tire was kind of wore out on this one, so we were going to replace that. You'll see it in a minute here. We're going to kind of a retro style tire to give it kind of the look we're going for. Also taking the fender off. We're going to end up replacing that just with a fork brace. So removing the fender completely. And the last thing, I'm taking the fuel tank off. Like I said before, we're going to a smaller, skinnier style tank. We probably could have kept this tank and just scraped or sanded all the paint off. But I guess I kind of wanted a different style tank, so that's the direction we're going on this one. And here's the tire change. The bead was really stuck on this tire. It did not want to break loose at all. We ended up having to put a bunch of clamps around the tire to kind of squeeze it off of the bead. So it took a lot of effort, but it eventually did come off. If you've ever changed one of these tires before, you know how difficult it can be. I've heard of people doing a lot of different things, but it seems like just putting C-clamps around it is the fastest way to break the bead loose when it's really stuck on there like this one was. Even at this point, this tire was a struggle to get off. We just had to slowly work our way around it, but trying to get that tire off of the rim was a real struggle. But here's the new tire. It's kind of the vintage style with all the straight lines to give it the classic look we're going for on this motorcycle. Just soaping it up and pressing it onto the new rim. This went on a lot easier than the old one came off, at least, so it wasn't too bad at this point. Here's the new tank now. Going with the bare metal look, so it was clear coated and everything just to keep the metal finish. It took a lot of prep work though. If you've ever bought an aftermarket tank like this before, they're not always in the best condition when you get them. And this one, when it was formed, a lot of lines were like scratched into the surface of the metal, so we had to do a lot of sanding to get those lines out and get it to a nice, smooth, clean surface. Then we put the clear coat on there, and that's the finished look then for this motorcycle. And here's the fork brace. Like I said, we're getting rid of the fender on this one, so just going with the fork brace. This is just a cheap one from Amazon. You can find probably dozens of people selling this exact thing on Amazon, but it'll get the job done. So I was originally planning to change the fender on this motorcycle too. I got a Tsunami style fender. But when I put it on, I decided I didn't really like the way it looked, at least not for this motorcycle. So you'll see in a second here, I decided to put the old fender on and just chop it. I didn't like the way the big stock style fender looked. I wanted something shorter, but the Tsunami just didn't look quite right, so I just decided to cut this one back a little bit. We're putting a Sissy Bar on this motorcycle as well, so I'm just putting that on here so I can kind of judge where I want to cut it at. I'll throw the seat on as well just to make sure I get a good visual on what this is going to look like after I cut it. I'm going to put a tape line across the fender now where I want to cut it. This is just so I can see where I want to cut it at and give me a little more accurate cut, something to track when I'm actually making the cut. I'll use a marker and put a line in the tape then where I'm planning to cut it, so I have a more exact path to follow. I'm going to use an angle grinder with a cutting wheel to do this cut. Probably not the best tool to use for this type of situation, but it's what I had available in the shop at the time, so I just made do with what was available. Just kind of taking it slowly, doing one piece at a time so I get it as straight as possible. There was a lot of holes in the fender as well, so I'm trying to make sure I cut all those away. That's kind of where I tried to place it so that I removed all the holes that were in there for like the tail light and various seat mounts and things like that. Cutting all those holes away, and then I got a nice clean fender to work with. Now that it's cut, I need to get all the paint off, so I decided to just sand it all off. I guess there's a few different ways you could take all the paint off, but I don't really like working with chemicals. Didn't have a sandblaster, so I just decided to take the time to slowly sand all the paint off. It took a couple hours, but it looks pretty good once it's all done here. There it is. Now I just got to put the motorcycle all back together. I forgot to turn on the camera when I put the tire back on or the wheel back on, but you can see it's on there now. Got the tank on already, so now it's the fender. I've also got the new turn signal and tail lights on there. They're really hard to see. They're really small bullet style lights. But they kind of hide in there with the frame, so you can't see them there. But I'm routing the wires through the fender here and then bolting everything together. I'm just setting the bolts in there for now to hold the fender in place, and then I'll grab the Sissy Bar and pull the bolts back out and get everything bolted together at one time. So the same bolts are holding the Sissy Bar and the fender on. It's just about done now. The last thing that still needs to be put on is the seat. So slide that on, get the bolt screwed in, and this thing is just about done.